Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack. Another M Plus season is now upon us with season 3, and that means another Exodia comp might be on the horizon. In this video, I want to talk about how M Plus is right now at the state of season 3, but also where we're going to be headed. Because at the beginning of the season, usually everything shows up, everything is viable, but we very quickly can shift into another Exodia meta, and I think that how M Plus is tuned at the moment is the key part for why the meta is restrictive for even like casual players or like not hardcore players, okay? So let's start it off. The big problem at the moment, the root core of like the Exodia and like everybody wanting to have like the meta and all of these other things comes down to how M Plus is tuned. When you slot your key in the hole and everything like that, you see, hey, monsters are going to deal more damage to you, and they are going to have more health, depending on the key level. We all know this. The biggest thing, though, is that there's the Mythic 0 sort of scaling level. So like they have a core scaling level, and then from that, it grows at a steady rate depending on Tyrannical or Fortified and the key level. That just increases the health from there. When they did PTR testing, I made a previous video saying, like, hey, M Plus is going to be hard. And the root of that was saying, hey, there's like a crazy amount of stops, there's a crazy amount of interrupts that are in these dungeons. Right now on PTR, we're kind of cheesing everything because we just roll up and then drop 30 seconds of crowd control into monsters, and then they're all dead, and then they don't cast anything. And so it's easy as we do that. But that video, I talked about how I assumed that the mob health would get substantially increased. So yeah, you could lock mobs down for 30 seconds, but then they're still alive for another 30 seconds beating your face in. And so you need to run more kicks, you need to run more stops and more frequent stops instead of just having like a chain of CC. The problem with that video is that the mob health increased a little bit, but not quite enough. So the dungeons that we're seeing at the moment, I was doing like a 20 week 1 of a Taldazar, by far the easiest dungeon at the start before they increased the mob percentage, probably still one of the easiest. And we had like 10 or 12 deaths or something like that for a week 120. We still like 2-chested it because the mobs just fell over because they didn't increase mob health enough. And so that's like the key sort of point of frustration and how it bleeds into the meta for everything else. Where we really see the meta becoming like very static and then it naturally sort of trickles down to everyone else is that you're forced, or rather encouraged, for the path of least resistance to be able to run compositions that are able to give you survivability and mob control in mass. Burst damage helps as well, but at earlier levels and like lower levels early on in the season, the mob health isn't the problem. When they get up to like world first levels, like the obscene bleeding edge, that'll eventually become a problem. But right now, you're seeing Aug Evoker and Vengeance Demon Hunter tearing it up. And because that combination is so potent, where the Aug Evoker can Oppressing Roar, and then the Vengeance Demon Hunter is going to be able to drop the Sigil of Silence, which is extended by Oppressing Roar. They also have Sigil of Chains, they also have an AoE stun, they also just do a lot of damage on their own. Vengeance Demon Hunter far and away starts outpacing all of the other tanks because it kind of brings just everything. Now, I mentioned like damage isn't going to be the biggest issue early on, but Vengeance also does a lot of that too. And so you sort of compile all these benefits into one spec. Aug Evoker, of course, is increasing burst damage with things like Breath of Eons. It's also increasing survivability by nature of its rallying cry with Obsidian Scales. And of course, like I mentioned, Pressing Roar allows you to shut down mobs for a much greater period of time so that you could like stun the mobs really quickly and have a longer lasting stun from the Demon Hunter, and then also be able to have a Sigil of Silence that's also going to be extended over the course of that Oppressing Roar. Those things in combination give you a lot more control over the mobs that other tanks don't bring to you, while also doing heavy damage and buffing the damage of others, that it naturally starts shifting down in the meta to everybody else. Because yes, while a Prot Warrior can do Spell Reflect, then they can have an easy time on XYZ boss with Spell Reflect or whatever, like they can have some niche value there. They're not, by comparison, going to shut down as many enemies as frequently as you're going to see like Vengeance Demon Hunter does. Prot Pally also is another good example, and it was dominant in Season 1 just by how frequently you were able to shut down enemies. But the health of the mobs was also much higher, in that it took longer for trash packs to fall over because you couldn't just burst them down, and so you needed the frequency of the shutdown that a Prot Pally brought, In addition to, of course, the off-healing benefits, the 4 DPS 1 prot pally tank runs that we saw, all of those things that sort of like dominated Season 1. But the longer that it takes to kill off the enemies, the greater emphasis it is on having high-skilled damage dealers, the greater emphasis it is on constant and frequent kicks, interrupts, coordination, shutdowns, things like that. But when the mob health is lower, then you could run with specific compositions that mostly do their job. If you hit an oppressing roar, hit a sigil of silence onto a big pack of casters, for example, you are going to net like 10-15 seconds of shutdowns. Then you have stuns, then you have things like sigil of chains, and it concentrates the shutdowns into one character, or maybe two, instead of having everybody coordinating together to shut down an entire trash pack constantly and working together to do it. You are focusing the effort and you're focusing the responsibility into individual players to sort of like carry. And then when the mob health is also not super high, you can pretty much just do your damage rotation and do, enough damage so that the mob packs are going to fall over. And then there's not as much emphasis on like the damage dealer skill until obviously you get to bleeding edge level. There's not as much emphasis on like the healer to be able to heal you through the problems. Because if you've done any fortified keys over the past couple weeks, you'll know that, if a cat jumps on you, or 2 cats jump on somebody, they're just dead. And so having the Aug Evoker to increase stamina, having healers that bring damage reduction resources like Paladin, maybe Disc Priest, for like the absorb type effects or damage reduction with barrier, those things are great. And you kind of just stack all of these damage reduction effects, or you just stack big bursty cooldowns to try to muscle through it. But the health pools of allies is just not high enough relative to the damage they're receiving that it's really difficult to be able to heal through lots of missed kicks and heal through areas where mobs are unleashed and they're not being shut down constantly. And that is, I think, one of the big core reasons why you start seeing the meta shift so heavily for all players, is that when you have the responsibility focused into individuals that have high mob shutdown, there's less responsibility for the rest of the group. There's more focus on that individual to bear the brunt of dealing with the mob crowd control, and it allows everybody else to just smash buttons and try to survive as best they can. When you get into higher level keys, of course, when you get into what I would call like the elite level of keys, the 0.5%, the 1%, yeah, everybody's going to need to learn how to use their defensives. But you get into a very similar scenario as when Aug Evoker first came out, that you can brute force your way in pugs just by playing a lot, by brute forcing mobs down, not coordinating interrupts, not coordinating crowd controls, leaning on like a tank player who's playing the meta, or leaning on the benefits that Aug Evoker brings to be able to just get a lot of IO early. And then you start mixing into the level of elite keys. And that's where you have a divide, where you might have somebody who's done, let's say, all 21s at this point in this season, since we're only 3 weeks in. They might have done all 21s, which might indicate that they're in a position where they know all the mob stops, they know all the boss mechanics. But if you just play enough and you brute force enough, you can get away with not knowing those things up to a certain level. And then when you're trying to go higher into keys, you get a similar situation that you did in Season 2, where some people don't know what's going on, but they have the same IO, maybe a very similar item level as you, and that's where it causes frustration, because you don't know if you should invite this AUG, you don't know if you should invite this other meta DPS spec or something, because it's the tanks that can carry really hard. It's sometimes the healer, if they're able to properly know how the damage is coming out, or how to like use immunes on players, or how to like also do a lot of crowd control, kicks, stops, in addition to their healing output. But I think that the biggest carry role for Season 3 is probably going to be the tanks, and that the ability for healers to help carry through heavy damage, and the ability for them to carry through like a lot of trash packs in particular, is reduced, because a lot of times it comes to stopping the mob from doing the damage event to begin with, rather than trying to muscle heal through it. There are some examples like Swell, of course, in Throne of the Tides, but sometimes when you get like 20 stacks of the disease on you, you can't really heal through that. So there's some areas, of course, where healers can shine, as there always is, but I think that they get reduced the burstier the damage is, and the more that it seems like damage on your allies exceeds the health that must be burned through on the trash mobs. If everybody can kind of just steamroll a trash pack if they have damage cooldowns up, you don't really think about the damage that it does to you until you don't have damage cooldowns up, and then cats are just jumping on you all over the place and you're getting annihilated. And so that's sort of the crux of the issue. The really big reason why this has happened, like I mentioned at the start of the video, is because Blizzard, in my opinion, set themselves up for failure in PTR testing. We tested PTR with about 440 or 450 item level, which is the equivalent of LFR and Emirdrasil. And then we still, for some reason, are not in a position where we have to test all the affixes. You could play build a key, and then you have everybody who wants to do M+ is just running no affix keys, and I've done them myself, I'll fully admit it, where the path of least resistance is the path that players take, and it's the path that players are always going to take, whether it's PTR or live. And so by not forcing players to play with affixes, by not changing around the item level that players are playing and operating with, that also hurts class balance, by the way, because you don't really know which specs are going to do great at 470 and 480 eye level unless you're seeing it. Those things really start affecting M+, and the crux of it is you also don't get to see how hard things hit when you're only at this small reduced eye level of LFR when players are trying to find the path of least resistance on PTR to push as high as they can. Players want to experience something new on the PTR, not so much as like being perfect testers for Blizzard. And so if Blizzard wants the players to be better testers, they need to constrain the environment with how you're testing so that you're forced to do M+ keys, that there's going to be different eye levels that you're going to be testing at. And then they need to be able to make the adjustments in PTR, like changing around the count required for a Taldazar in the PTR, and not mid-season when people are still learning the dungeons and building out routes that are then invalidated a week later. Let me know what you guys think. I'm very hopeful for this season, and I don't want to put some like negative damper over it, but I do foresee some of the like, unforced errors that Blizzard is putting forth once again, and I feel frustrated by it because I think a lot of it is able to be mitigated by better planning and better preparation. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Be sure to subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Let me know what you all think, and I'll catch you all next time.